Welcome. One. Welcome everyone to tonight's class on painting a purple passion flower. This is part 2 of a class that we started last week. So if you missed part 1, you can find the recording of that class on YouTube. And in tonight's class, we are going to pick up where we left off. We just got maybe the first couple of layers of watercolor on our painting, and it's going to be mixed media. So we'll be starting with some pen and ink tonight, and then adding some layers of watercolor to that. Before I move on to talk about our supply list, I just wanted to mention the classes that we have coming up in October. So tonight's class is the last class for September, and then I have a 1 week off, and then I'll be back first week of October with drawing ears, and we're going to use contour lines and draw an ear. And then after that, we are going to be sketching this lovely, well, we're going to work on sketching for a painting, which I just realized I forgot to grab the painting, but I have it right here. If I can grab it without knocking any things over in my stacks here. We're going to be working our way up to this lovely painting of lemon and thyme. So that is what's coming up in October. And you can register for those classes the same place that you signed up for tonight's class. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'll go ahead and switch to my tabletop view and go over supplies. Don't forget to tag your work with the hashtags Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes, and you can follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge. It's my nickname. I recently changed my Instagram handle, so it was formerly Adrienne Hodge Art, but I'm on Facebook, Adrienne Hodge Fine Art, and there's some of my business cards with some of my work using mainly calligraphy ink. Okay, so we are going to be continuing on with the same supply list as last week, but I'm just going to go over all those supplies again. We're done with our sketchbook and pencils, but you know, you can always have it on hand if you need to work out any issues, and I'll definitely review what we went over before I jump back in here. And we've got Artist Loft supplies from Michael. So I've got Artist Loft illustration pens, a set of those. I've got a set of Artist Loft watercolor paintbrushes. I've got this lovely Artist Loft watercolor set that comes in a cute little case like this. A little key of all the colors that are in there. And let's see, what else? We've got our Artist Loft watercolor paper pad. And then tonight we're going to be adding some Artist Loft gouache in here as well, so we can get some opaque layers to happen. So gouache is opaque watercolor. And you're going to want some paper towels and some water cups, which I have behind me, and possibly some extra plastic palettes to mix up colors in. And we already used our tape last week, but if you're having to retape, then you'll want to grab your tape. All right, I think that's it. Oh, and then I put a white gel pen on the supply list as well. I believe I did, in case somebody doesn't have gouache. You might add some of the white highlights that we're going to add with the gouache. You might do that with a white gel pen instead. Okay, so I think that's everything. Except for our reference photo, which was included in the supply list. So PDF with this reference photo. And if you're watching later on YouTube, You can click underneath the video where it says see more about the content of the video, and it will give you the supply list along with that PDF to download. Okay, so let's review what we covered last week before we jump back in here. The first thing we did was pick apart this purple passion flower and look at it as a whole, zoom in, zoom out. We looked at its parts. Initially, we drew it in 2 dimensions here, so we flattened it out and just took all the 3-dimensional forms that make up that purple passion flower and made them really flat in 2D so we could just understand a bit of a diagram of the flower itself and the layers that are involved to this wacky pinwheel alien creature flower that we were studying here. And some lovely folks in the audience helped me identify the scientific names for some of these parts, which was fun. So then we looked at the contour lines and the elevational shift in these 3-dimensional forms, and we drew it again, but thinking about the 3 dimensions of these layers. And we talked about the value scale from 0 to 10. We noticed where the darkest parts of this flower are, where the lightest parts are. And we dissected some of these 3-dimensional forms to their most basic shapes. And then we zoomed in on different parts of the flower, like the corona filaments here. And then we sketched it again on our watercolor paper. Just get to that here. Well, first we taped down our paper so that we could create some fun margins so that when we peel off the tape, we'll have this lovely floating image here in the center. So we taped that off and then we sketched the flower again and started to layer things up. So far we've kept everything super light here. And so the next step that I want us to do is we're going to take these illustration pens while everything is nice and dry, and we're going to go ahead and bring out some of the fun detail in this purple passion flower and just go ahead and give it like a loose illustration vibe with the pens, and mostly just to bring it forward and start to develop it a little more here. Okay, so let me actually go back to my sketchbook for just a hot minute here with the pens. We don't need to go too deeply into all of the techniques and strategies of drawing in pen and ink, but we have had a number of classes in pen and ink, and you could even just Google pen and ink or the word pen and my name on YouTube and see all the videos with Michael's that I've done on drawing with pen and ink over the last 3 years. Just sneaking a drink of my coffee there. Okay, so we've got these different nib sizes. I'm just going to real briefly go over here. So I've got 2 of the same one there. I got a 0.5, a 0.03, I got a 0.1, and I got a 0.005. So the bigger the 0, in front of it, like if there's a double zeros, 0.005 or 0.05, the bigger the number, what am I trying to say? The smaller the number, the smaller the nib, obviously. But you can just take the, pens out and just test your nibs and just see how thin all of your lines are. And we'll do a little bit of hatching, which is one directional lines. And then we've got cross hatching. which is lines that overlap going in different directions. So we might have diagonal, vertical, horizontal. We're not really going to get too much into hatching and cross hatching, but just to test out your nibs and see, you know, these different marks that we can make with our pens. Maybe try this with all of your pens so you can get a feel for it. We definitely are going to use a little bit of stippling, which is one directional dots. And when I was gathering the videos for Rich to drop in the chat tonight, I totally did not think about how we were going to be doing so much pen and ink here, or a little bit of pen and ink, and that I should have included a video on pen and ink shading techniques. But if you were to search that on YouTube, and my name should be pretty easy to find the classes that have covered these techniques in more depth. So we've got hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and then scribbling. And I switched to a bigger nib as I was going here. So you can test out all your different nibs and just see how they vary whenever you use a thicker or thinner nib here. And it's all about the amount of pressure that we're putting on this pen and how much we're overlapping these marks is what's going to give us different values. We're not going to do a whole lot. I would say the main thing we're going to be doing is not really a hard outline, but a very loose implied outline of some of the darker value areas and some of the areas that we know we're just going to add lots of color to. And like I said, make it a little bit more like an illustration and have it just come forward here. So
Adrienne, we have two questions. One is from Autumn. She's
okay.
asking, what can you use if you don't have an ink pen?
If you happen to have a maybe a charcoal pencil, or I mean, I would just leave it out if you don't have pens, honestly. I don't know what else to suggest. Yeah, I would just not do this part. Yeah, maybe a charcoal pencil would work, or if you have watercolor pencils, this could be, but I would save this for the end if you're, because we're about to add water on top of it. Also, if you don't have these Artist Loft illustration pens, test your pens off to the side before you draw on this that we're about to go over with watercolor paint, and make sure that the pen that you're using is waterproof. Some pens might say that they are permanent, but that does not mean that they are waterproof. So, you know, just draw a little bit and then drop some water onto it with your paintbrush and see if it bleeds. If it bleeds, it's not waterproof. But these Artist Loft illustration pens are waterproof, and so are a number of other drawing pens brands. All right, I'm going to use a really thin nib, so I'm going to use that 0.05. Where did it go? I want my lines to be really thin. I mean, honestly, the reason for this is just to have it come forward a little bit, make it pop, and add a little bit of flair and style to it. So we're going to start in the areas where we're seeing the darkest values. So that would be in the center of the flower here with our corona filament. And I am just going to bounce around quite a bit here and just start to outline them sporadically. So jumping around, mostly just looking at my pencil lines and finding interesting moments in my pencil lines that I might want to emphasize with my pen, and I'm keeping it really light and loose. And then I might go up here and outline some of these leaves. And yeah, you can skip this part if you just don't want pen in your mixed media drawing. I'll admit, oftentimes when I'm planning these classes, I do certain things based on just the nature of teaching classes on Zoom. Like for one, it's always frustrating last week, you know, with a class like where we're doing mostly graphite and light washes of watercolor. It's really hard to see what's going on in my demonstration when I'm keeping everything so light. And adding some pen is just a nice, quick way to go ahead and make everything come forward so that y'all can see it and you can have a better vision of where we're going. But if you don't like the way it looks on mine, then don't add it to yours. I'm looking back and forth between my photo quite a bit. I've got it just off screen here. And I'm trying to not put any like hard outlines anywhere that it's super light. Although actually it is pretty light inside of these things and I'm still outlining them. So we're definitely taking some artistic license with this mixed media piece and going for kind of like a whimsical sort of vibe. So not very realistic. We spent all that time really breaking it down and talking about realism last week, and then we're kind of throwing it out the window a little bit. But that's what it takes to do a good illustration, is to have an understanding of the real world so that you're abstracting the real world a little bit. So to have that understanding of what's actually happening in the real world enables you to sort of cartoonify it in a natural way. And I just realized one of my main, forgot what these were called, the stamens, I think. I kind of painted over them a little bit. I'm gonna try to bring it back out with my pen. Maybe I can resurrect it even more with my gouache later if I'm mindful of that area. So the easiest way to make your pen marks kind of loose and carefree like this is to just not stay in the same place for too long. If I stay in the same place for too long, my drawing movements might start to become kind of stagnant or stiff or forced in a way. But jumping around keeps it kind of loose and keeps some movement in there. I see Diane saying it'd be nice to see what I'm referring to. So you should have a copy of the reference photo. It's difficult for me to keep the reference photo on the screen at all times, and sometimes it messes with my light on Zoom here. It kind of makes my drawing disappear a little bit. But yeah, you should have the reference photo handy. I'm just looking at the photo that you have a copy of. And I bet you can see it a lot better on your version of it than you would be able to see it on the screen anyway, next to my drawing. You can zoom in on it yourself. Okay. This is such a tedious flower. There's I mean, all flowers are very repetitive and tedious, but there's a lot of repetitive movements. And also I'm just outlining my drawing. So most of the time I'm kind of like, once I get into these repetitive movements, I'm not even really looking at the reference photo too much. I was at first when I was in that that center area. But now that I'm just bouncing around, I'm mostly just looking at my drawing and where my pencil lines were emphasized and sticking out, or moments that I feel like look interesting, that feel like they need a little pen outline, a very loose pen outline. I'm not doing a hard outline around the whole thing. I'm really jumping around quite a bit. And you can always go back in and add more pen. Later, after we add the watercolor, if you're like, oh, I need a little more outline, you can always go in and add more pen when it's dry. So we can either do it now or we can do it at the end when it's dry. So if you're on the fence about whether or not to use the pen, I actually did not add it until towards the end of the process last time, because like I said, I was like, wow, this is taking a long time to bring this thing to life with just the watercolor and the gouache, and I felt like I was finessing it quite a bit, and I'm trying to be aware of the time. Like, can I do this again in the time allowed in my Michael's class? And I thought, oh, if we add some pen to it, then we can really expedite the process a little bit here, bring it to life a little faster, and create some contrast. And the area I was thinking where we might add a little stippling is just a tiny bit here in the middle. Let's zoom in on it in the photo so you can see what I'm referring to on the, oh, I'm forgetting the name of those flower parts. Let's see if I can flip back to the page. Okay, so we had the ovaries were in the center there. We had the stemma, are these things that stick out. And then these were the stamens, the bone-like structure. So the stemma, these things that I was describing, like they look like a piece of tape, little piece of flower petal tape on the end of them. Anyway, they have dots on them, which I feel like stippling would be appropriate to add there, just to add some texture. So, and again, don't have to make it exactly like the photograph. Just notice how there's some stippled dots that make sense here. And again, these can always be added later. If you feel like it looks really nice, but you want to add more at the end, you can. When it's dry. Like I said, we can do it now or we can do it when it's dry, but I predict that I am not going to have another moment in my demonstration here where this is going to be dry, because once we start adding all our wet layers to it. But after the class is over, you can always go back and add these things. And then in the center of the flower here, we could also start to do some stippling dots. So they're just little dots that we stack on top of each other to start to overlap them and create a darker value. We could do this with our watercolor paint, but doing it with the pen now. At this point, we'll go ahead and create some contrast for us. So it'll expedite the process of making this flower come to life a little faster. And if you feel like these lines are not bold enough for you, you can go back over with a thicker nib pen and do everything that I just did again and make it come forward even more. Like, let me switch to a thicker nib for just a second here. And I'm not gonna do the whole thing all over again, but I am gonna just bounce around one more time. Let's see if I can make a little more contrast in the center happen. This little transitional area from the corona filaments, where they first start to spread out and overlap the rest of the flower underneath with the big flower petals. That's where our darkest value is. We could even keep all of our watercolor super light and just let this pen that we're adding be the darkest thing. Because it is a pretty light flower overall, except for the center. All right, I think that's pretty good for me. So I'm ready to start adding some watercolor back in here. Gathering up my watercolor supplies here. So we're going to stick to watercolor for a while, and then we're going to switch to the gouache for really just the last finishing touches. Most of this is watercolor, except for, see how there are these moments on the corona filament where I have this lavender, this really pale lavender color that is coming out, and it's sitting on top of the darker watercolor, so it's opaque. And what gouache is opaque watercolor. And I actually have, we had a class on the differences between the three popular water media that I like to use the most, watercolor, ink, and gouache, a while back, and I gave Rich the link to that class on YouTube. So you can refer back to it, where we painted these strawberries in watercolor, same strawberry in gouache, and then the same strawberry in ink. And they all turned out looking a little different. But you can just see the difference between the watercolor and the gouache. So the gouache is just more opaque and the watercolor is more transparent. And then the ink is even more opaque and had kind of a glossy finish compared to the two of them. Okay, so that's what we're going to add with the gouache. We'll add some white, we'll add some of that pale purple, and just do some stuff basically to get these. Is the only other way that we could do this with watercolor is to plan ahead and leave this blank. And so we'd really have to be painting like these keyhole spaces of green in between them on the leaves, and that would be way more challenging. We could use masking fluid and do that with watercolor, but the easiest way to do it is to just let that layer in the background dry and then go over it with the opaque gouache and put those light lavender purple corona filaments in there and some of those white highlights, bring them back to life using the gouache. And I don't consider that cheating. I have definitely taught some traditional watercolorists who would gasp in horror to see me adding some white gouache on top of it. But I am not a traditional watercolorist, so I don't mind. All right, so my three favorite paintbrushes, you may find that you prefer different paintbrushes, but I feel like I can get the entire job done in pretty much any painting with a flat brush, a round brush, and a liner brush like this. So some variations on those. grab whatever brushes speak to you. It's always your preference might be different than mine. Okay, and I've got my watercolors here. We're gonna work our way from our background forward again, which is how we were working last week, although we did start in the center a little bit there and then work on the brown background. But I'm gonna go ahead and do this brown and green background first. Then I'll work on the center so that the background can be drying, and we'll kind of go back and forth in that way. So we're doing really good on time. Let's go ahead and I'm going to use my palette just so that my washes don't drip down my table, which is on an incline here, but you can mix your colors up in the lid of your palette, of your watercolor palette there if you don't have one of these handy. I also just always happen to have some eyedroppers on hand, so I am going to use an eyedropper, but if you want to just take your paintbrush and just dip it in your water cup and then just keep dripping into your palette here, we're just going to get some water and then add some color to our water, because the key word in watercolor is water. And oftentimes people just don't use enough of it. And I think it's better to start out super thin. You can always add more layers on top of that. And we just had a class a couple weeks ago on watercolor basics, watercolor techniques of layering. And actually, I have those examples right here. I might as well show them. And maybe Rich could grab the link to those chats for anybody, or to those classes for anybody who missed it, and drop it in the chat. But we talked about wet on wet flat washes, wet on dry flat washes, variegated washes, all these different techniques that we can do. But the main thing that I was trying to push in that class was this idea of working in layers, which is the cornerstone of painting with water media. You have to let your layers dry before you move on to the next layers. If you want to be successful with watercolor and successful in that, the way we often see watercolors and want to paint like them. I mean, you can always do whatever you want and get different, interesting effects, but working in layers is an optimal way to work with watercolor. So you let each layer dry before you go to the next one, and the thinner you work on those initial layers, the more you can build up to darker layers and darker colors. So you don't necessarily have to make everything super thick to get a dark, interesting effect. So that's why we still want a good amount of water in these colors that we're mixing up here. And we're looking for a few different greens and browns here. So let's say, go ahead and go with 5 colors here. We're gonna do 2 different browns and 3 different greens. Oh my goodness, so sorry. Open my camera here. So we'll have a dark brown, and then a lighter brown, and then we'll have a brownish green. So we're going to start with the brown. And you try a few different greens, see what sort of combinations of greens look good to you. So maybe I might even add 2 greens to this. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. I want like a really nice army green. And we've got a darker and a lighter version of that. Nope, actually I just made the same color twice. Here, let's add this phthalo green to that, make it a little different. So yeah, you're just gonna really make your greens more earthy by adding some brown to them. All right, but then we do want one really nice yellowy green. So I'm gonna start with my yellow. Like that. So that's gonna give us that really bright, vibrant green that we're seeing on a lot of those leaves. I'm going to stick with my round brush. Now this is where it gets increasingly complicated to get my reference image anywhere near the screen because I got so much else going on here. But I'm looking at these dark areas. Let me switch to a little bit smaller rounded brush. I had a bigger one and I'm just switching to a smaller one. And I'm just looking at these areas of kind of keyhole spaces here at the top where it's dark brown. And I want to start to build up that dark brown, create maybe a little bit of a vignette, and then stippling again with my paintbrush and just bouncing around, starting to, and letting it cool. So this is another thing we talked about in that watercolor basics class was letting it kind of create a little puddle or pool on the page and then leaving it alone and letting it dry in its own way that creates these fun little effects and striations. So really trust the process. Maybe go ahead and drop some of this other brown in here too and let it bleed a little bit. And if it starts to feel like too much, you can grab your paper towel and pull it out. You can do this as many times as you want, as many layers as you want. You just let it dry first, and it's going to dry a little bit lighter than it looks when it goes on. It's going to settle down into the page, and it's going to create those interesting striations, and it's going to look different. So you really can't judge it when it's wet, and that's the main reason to not keep painting into it and to not continue to act upon it and to just leave it alone and let it do its thing. And if you get any weird drips, then obviously you can grab them with a paper towel, pull them out of there. Yeah, I almost forgot that we've got this big area of gray since my photo was taken on the side of the road. So got some gray of the road there. You could just make it all brown if you wanted to, but I'm gonna go ahead and make a gray. And I'm just gonna, excuse me, just water down some black to make that gray. So just a really watered down black. And I'm just gonna quickly spread that gray around. Oh, I meant to outline that particular leaf a little more with the pen and ink, and I didn't. Oh, and yikes, I just realized I'm going into my leaf right there instead of, that's a leaf, and I just filled it in with gray. All right, well, no harm to that. I was just able to pull that out. With some paper towel. Oh, I think I might be slightly off screen here. Let me push this up a little bit.
I was just about to ask you. Um, Diana has a question. She said, do you have any sort of strategy as you're starting to put the colors? Do you start on the outside and work in, or?
Yes, starting from the background and working my way forward. So yeah, the outside in, if that makes more sense. the main idea is that if we're going to continue working while things are wet, like we are tonight, because we have to for the sake of time. If we had more time, I would say just paint this background and then take a break. Go get a cup of coffee, scroll on your phone, walk around, just take a minute and just let it dry. Uh, and then come back to it and paint anything that's touching, because we do have a little bit of a challenge when we're pressed for time like this in a class like this, in that um, I have to keep going even though some of the background layers could be a little wet. So my strategy for us, and sometimes I work this way when I'm, just being impatient, is I'm not gonna do anything that's touching the background next. I'm gonna start working on the center of the flower and then work my way back out. But ideally, working from the background and working your way forward is a great way to work, because um, then you don't have any weird keyhole spaces that you're trying to paint. Like if we had done the entire flower first and just completely ignored the background, then once we got to the background, we'd be painting all these tiny little spaces in between. So it just makes more sense. Like if you're painting a tree in the sky, to go ahead and paint the sky first. That way you don't have to paint sky in between little spaces in between leaves. It just doesn't make any sense to do it that way. You paint yourself into a corner. So yeah, always, or typically, always is a risky word, but typically work from the background and work your way forward. Okay, I feel like I accidentally made some leaves brown up there. So yeah, even with the leaves right now, if I were to do the leaves, then they're gonna bleed into my background that I just did, which probably happened a little bit the last time I painted them. So like, you can work fully from the background and work your way forward, but you just have to be patient and let layers dry as you go. But since we're gonna just keep pressing forward, we're gonna go ahead and work on the center now. So we're gonna mix up some purples and pinks, and we already have our greens for the center. So actually, since we already have our greens for the center, let's do that next. Use this really light, bright green here. I'm gonna just use yellow here in the center. I'm just watering down a little bit of yellow off screen here, and go ahead and paint those little so yeah, I realize I'm doing the opposite of what I said, because now we're working on the thing that's the closest to us in the foreground, or in the topmost thing. But sometimes you got to just make exceptions to that rule for the sake of a class like this. I am going to let my bright green bleed into that. And I'm not really going for the most realistic color here, but something that definitely feels fun and eye-catching. I'm going to take this bright green and add a little bit of white to it off camera. I don't know if that's going to show up how I'm mixing on my palette here. No, it's not. So I'm just adding some white to that light green, because I happen to have white in this palette, in this Artist Loft set, and then using that for the These are the stamens, right? It's the stamens, the stemma, and the corona filaments. And this is another thing we can add some gouache on top of, like I accidentally painted some purple and stuff through that one, so but I can use my gouache to bring that forward again. And then the ovaries here, might drop a little dark green in there and let it bleed. And again, if you don't like the way this looks in this layer, just leave it alone, let it dry. You might like it when it's dry. We can always add another layer to this later. So by working thin like this, we have the opportunity to go back in and add to it when it's dry. Okay, so we should be safe to start working on these purple areas now. But if you catch yourself coming up too close to something that we just did that's going to be wet, then just be mindful, because then you'll have, your green bleeding into your purple. The safest way to not have that happen would be to just let it all dry before you do anything that's touching the wet area. You can also use a blow dryer. I'm not going to grab my blow dryer just because I think it's more trouble than it's worth. Though I did use it a little bit in that watercolor basics class. All right, so we just want a few different violets here. Darker violet. Let's see if I can get my palette to be on the screen. So I'm using my pure violet here. I guess I could read off what the names of them are on my little transparency. So this is my manganese violet in this set, this Artist Loft set. We started making this rose violet last week, which we already added, and I added a lot more pink to this flower than I'm actually seeing. So I'm just adding my rose madder, which is right next to the manganese violet in this palette. Adding those two together to get a rose violet. And then we'll make a paler violet. So you can do that by either just watering down your violet, or maybe add a little bit of your white, if you have white in your set, to it to really make it a nice pale lavender color. Okay, that should be good for our violets.
Adrienne, Ed is wondering, is there a benefit to painting the lights before the darks or vice versa?
Ask the question again. I kind of missed the bulk of it.
Is there a benefit of painting the lights before the darks or vice versa?
Oh, yes. Yeah, the benefit to painting the lights before the dark is that you can always make it darker. And if you go too dark, then you can't take it back if you don't want it to be that dark. So it's always going to be better to, you're going to have more control. Not, it's always going to be better. I got to catch myself when I say stuff like that. You know, always nothing is always, right? Nothing is always any one way, but you're going to have more control over it if you keep things thin and light. You can always add another layer. So that's the benefit of painting light to dark. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna start with this lighter lavender color and just, continue on like we started last week, building up these colors and these layers. And yeah, this could be very tedious if you really take your time. And definitely, whenever I'm planning for a class like this, I want it to be successful. I want it to be the way that I want it to look. So I take my time and I don't rush the process at all. And that's why it was taking so long in the planning phase for this class to get it to look the way I wanted it to look, because I was taking my time and working from light to dark and building up these layers. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I've spent so much time on this. So how can I start to bring it to life a little faster? And the idea that I came up with was the pen and ink and the gouache. Okay, so I am gonna go ahead and switch to that darker purple a little bit and start to get a little bit of an ombre thing to happen here. And again, this would be the least risky move if you waited for everything to dry before you did this. And I'm just gonna go for it now and start to paint some of these corona filaments with the dark purple, but I've got the dark purple really watered down, so it's not as risky as it could be. And we'll probably have to do this a few times, but maybe we can let it bleed a little bit into that lighter lavender, let it do its natural effects here. And if you go too dark or you add too much, that's what our gouache is going to be for. Our gouache is going to help us correct a lot of mistakes. It's going to be like white out. We're going to be able to go back in here and add the white on top. Bring back anything that we maybe lost while we were creating this effect here in the center. Don't worry about if you're accidentally filling in spaces, as long as you have that gouache. If you don't have the gouache, then I would be really mindful of where you want it to be white, where you want to leave that blank paper alone. And if you feel like you're using thicker watercolor paint already, or you're going way darker than me already, that is totally fine. Your painting can look a little different than mine, or you might get ahead a little faster. I'm just trying to take it slow and easy so that everyone can follow along with me. So there's obviously going to be some folks that are a little more advanced in the crowd. Okay, so now since I've been doing all that, my paper is starting to buckle. It's getting real wet and shiny there, and I can tell it's right on the edge of maybe starting to pill. It's getting too wet. The paper's telling me that's enough for that layer. So I could keep pushing it if I was impatient, but then I would just end up with kind of a yucky situation there in the center. So I'm going to listen to what the paper is telling me. And now is a good time to jump back to our background and paint these leaves, because they're not touching anywhere that's super wet on the paper, and this area should be dry. So we're just kind of working a strategy tonight to be able to keep going, even though some parts of the paper are wet. So now I'm going to take this light green and start to bounce around where I'm seeing that light green. And maybe I could even just go ahead and do the light green all over the stems and the leaves, and then go over it with the darker green and let that bleed in. That could be nice. Or I could just jump around looking at my reference photo where I'm seeing some lighter green colors, or just where lighter green colors feel nice and natural, because we don't have to make our whimsical illustration look identical to our reference photo. this one is already looking different from my other example, so I'm not even making an exact copy of the painting I made before. It's always going to be a little different, and we're not robots, so I imagine yours is going to look different from mine, so it's okay if you're using slightly different colors or anything like that. And I just went outside of my lines a little bit. I don't think it's a big deal. I'm just letting things kind of naturally bleed and let some fun, interesting stuff happen. Let the watercolor be watercolor. I'm dropping that dark green in there along with the lighter green and that mid-tone green and just letting it do its thing. If there's one thing I have learned as a parent and in relationships and as an artist with art materials, you cannot force people or art materials to do what you want them to do. You have to just let things be the way that they are. So let the watercolor be watercolor. Let it bleed and do fun, interesting stuff. Don't try to force your agenda on it because it's going to do what it wants anyway. All right. That's pretty good. I missed a big moment there where I could have. I forgot to put some gray in between there, but I'll catch that on the next pass. Okay, what's next? It's still wet in the center. Oh, I can add some more brown. But again, just being mindful not to go anywhere where my brown is going to bleed into my leaves too much. I'm going to go ahead and let it get pretty dark there in those corners because I did before. Oh, but I just went way too wet. So yeah, I think 2 layers is pretty okay for these leaves. And oh, I gotta be careful. I'm going really close to that green. So yeah, my green just bled into my brown a little bit, but whatever. It did on this one too. And maybe I went back and did a 3rd layer to cover up the spots where the green bled, but I think it ended up looking kind of cool. So not the worst thing ever if that's happening to you as well. But I do want it to be pretty dark there. I'm always a fan of a good vignette, making the background or the edges kind of darker so that it makes I think that's what makes the photograph interesting as well, is that darker background pushes the flower forward. So but if you had gone this dark and this thick from the beginning, then it might have been fine. But I like to just start out light, just to have the most control. And like I said, to model for the beginners in the class how to have the most control over this process. Especially for stuff like accidentally painting entire leaves with the wrong color. When it's super light, you just grab it back out with the paper towel. But if you go too dark, then you're stuck with it. So those early washes are kind of placeholders for what's coming next. And if you really like the way the dark brown looks, you can just keep, adding it anywhere you feel like it makes sense to have some more contrast. I'm definitely noticing with this demo how I can really make the flower come forward a lot faster if I do this dark brown, kind of maybe exaggerate it in some places I'm not seeing it, just for the sake of getting the flower to come forward. Okay. Let's see if my center is pretty dry now. It's still a little cold and wet, so ideally I would want to leave that alone, but I'm not. I'm gonna add some more dark purple now, and some of this is pink as well. Like I mentioned in last week's class, I decided at the end of planning this to go ahead and add a lot more pink to it, a lot more pink and red violet, just for the sake of art, of creative expression. I thought it looked good. So really, I'm just putting it everywhere I think it might be nice to put it, because there's really not that much pink in our photograph. And you can bleed your purple in there again. We're just getting a little bolder with the colors now. This is probably the last layer of watercolor I'm gonna do, and then I'm gonna let this dry and do the gouache next. So I'm really just looking for where I want some like watery effects before I'm moving on to the gouache. Okay. Now this is all very wet, and I need to let this dry. Okay, so I'm just gonna set everything aside for a second and give this a few minutes to dry. I mean, I could add onto the leaves if I wanted to, but instead I'm just gonna get my gouache ready and talk about the gouache and kill a little bit of time here while I let this dry. And there will be a question or two. I see somebody's asking if we've done a lesson using iridescent or metallic watercolors. We did use them a little bit for the class, the watercolor basic techniques. And you could definitely add them into this flower. I feel like it would be a nice effect. I think I maybe, like, did I put them on the supply list for this class? I think I might have, because it would be fun to add some of that iridescent purple in there. I honestly cannot remember. Rich, do you see that I put them on the supply list? I should have checked that. with anybody else.
I don't see the iridescents on this list,
Okay, then I
but they were
did.
definitely on your basic watercolor techniques video.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah,
Oh
so
no, it's here. It's
oh
here. It was hiding.
oh okay.
I'll I'll
Then
link it in the chat.
okay, yeah. I mean, if you wanted to grab those iridescent watercolors and drop some of them in there, I think I am not going to do that just because for the sake of time and all the things that are currently on my desk, I'm already getting little spills here. But yeah, that could definitely be another way to create some fun, whimsical effects here with this flower. Yeah, give me just a moment. I'm just trying to make some room. And switch to my gouache. Okay, and this gouache palette is really fun because it dries up, and I was talking to somebody who was saying that they have had issues with, it was a different brand, it wasn't this Artist Loft brand, but that they had issues with it molding from leaving it too wet. And I was like, oh, I just kind of let it dry out and then I spritz it or drop some water in there. So that's what I'm gonna do here, is just drop a little bit of water in my white, just the colors that I'm using, and my rose. And now my palette is a little messy and I accidentally dropped this on the floor one day. Got some cat hairs in here. I'm not thrilled about. Okay, so just my purple and um, rosy, red, violet, and white are the main colors that I'm going to use here. And I'm going to grab another palette off to the side here and go ahead and maybe even drop a little bit of water. Oh my goodness. There's so much going on under this camera sometimes. It's so hard not to bump it. All these paintbrushes and water cups and things. Okay, so I'm just really loading up my brush with this rose color. I want it to be thicker than that. I want it to be way thicker than that. Really got to get in here and moisten this because it gets so dry. But it's a delicate balance. Sometimes you don't want to leave this thing too wet either. So once you get your paintbrush moving around in there, it should be nice and malleable to start to get an opaque. Yeah, I probably, hang on. Why did I add that much water? I don't know what I was thinking. I'm going to dry these out with my paper towel. So if you started out with a really watery wash like that, maybe do the same thing I did. I just took my paper towel and soaked all that up. Because we really want opaque, thick versions of these colors to be happening. I might need to just go a little bit less, be a little bit less aesthetic and get this off the screen a little bit to really work it in here. And give it some elbow grease to get it moving. It's pretty dry. So I'm looking for just a nice, fluid, thick version of my red violet color and my lavender color. I'm starting to think I should have prepped this before the class started. I didn't think it was going to be this difficult to re-wet tonight. I'm gonna like really push my paintbrush in there. Try to get to the gooey center of this if I can. Okay, that's a little bit better. That's what I'm looking for. I just need some thick gouache to happen. Okay. Well, all of this is definitely giving my painting enough time to dry here. Okay, this is what I'm looking for. I need some really thick, gooey gouache here. So I'm just using white and violet and then a little bit of that rose color. But you could mix up any of these colors that we've already used with the watercolor and, you know, add some thicker versions of the gouache wherever you feel like you need it. Mostly I'm just looking to make those corona filaments pop now. So, and then also that white in the center and then the dark purple. And then if you need more contrast, that's when you go back in with your pens at the end if you'd like. Okay, so I'm starting out with the white and just adding the violet to it until I get this nice light lavender violet to happen. And you can add the pink rosy color to it as you feel necessary. And I'm going to use this thin liner brush and try to just draw these corona filaments back in here. So we'll start like around the point when they start to do that ombre thing and go out with them and kind of flick my wrist to get that little curly Q thing to happen wherever I'm seeing that. And we're just gonna jump around and do this with this color and the white. And because our gouache is so opaque, it's gonna it's gonna show up against the rest of those colors in a way that really stands out. It's gonna give it that matte texture. So some of the corona filament do appear more of a dark purple, and then some of them appear more white. And after a while, you don't even necessarily need to look at your reference photo. You can just look at where you drew. Hopefully you drew some of these in there with your pencil or your pen, and you can just follow your drawing and add some darker purple ones or this lighter lavender. I mean, it's gonna be darker than the white ones that we're gonna add. And then we'll do the same thing with our white. You just want it wet enough that it's fluid. If it's too dry, then it's gonna look a little scratchy. But you want it nice and thick. So we're using it pretty thick here. And we can do this again with our darker purple too, because there are some of them that appear even darker. Oh my goodness. My camera just caught my end of my paintbrush and made it fly out of my hand. Oh, pole vault just happened. All right, it's starting to come together. All right, and then the other thing we can do with our white, this is the part where I might have to just be like a cooking class and jump to my more completed one here. This is the part that you might do with a, yeah, you could bust out your iridescent watercolors if you wanted. You could, you know, add some more watercolor. But to get those, like that little checker pattern that's happening on the corona filament, this is where you're going to want to go in with your white or your white gel pen when it's totally dry and put in those details again. So I'm doing it with the white since I already have my white on my paintbrush, but I'm going to add the dark purple here because this is that really high contrast area that we're looking for. You could do this with the watercolor as well. I'm adding a little bit of indigo blue to this purple just to make it even darker purple because it shows up. I mean, it could almost be black. It's so dark purple in the center there. You could even add a little bit of black to it or maybe some brown to be a little more subtle. Let me add some black to it and see what happens. Oh, geez. The black's a little too dry. Okay, here we go. We are really looking for a dark purple here. And again, you want it thick enough that you can get it kind of fluid. And I would just go back and forth like this between the dark and the light. You don't necessarily have to wait for everything to completely dry because you're working so thick with it and you're not really going over the same area twice. You're creating this little checker pattern. And then this is so much darker than the rest of it right now. So we'll definitely have to like get some of that red violet in there to blend it out. So yeah, this is where I'm going to just switch over to my other example here and just point out what I did, because this is one of those that I ended up just having to finesse so much more than me. I knew I was going to go overtime, but I was like, I think I can get it if I make it a 2-part class. I think I can do it in, 3 hours total here. And we did, we got pretty far, but you're definitely going to have to continue on your own if you're just at that point that I was. So, I just kept going in there and just adding the dark purple and then the red violet and the white. And you could use the gouache, the white gouache, or you could use the white gel pen. If it was totally dry, you could draw on it with a white gel pen. And then this was the last thing that I did. So I loaded up my paintbrush with my white. This is one of my favorite things to do, just like to add some whimsy, is load up my paintbrush with some white that's kind of milky. I'm going to do it to the other one since it's taped. And then just hold the brush kind of tight and tap it, and you'll get some little star splatter, or maybe like some little fairy dust splatter, or maybe it might even feel like snow, but that's a fun effect that you can add. And I added that to this one as well. And then, like I said, I did the pen last on this one, just to bring it back to life a little bit. So that's what all I did. And I did not actually add the iridescent watercolor to it, but that's definitely something that you could do. You could bleed those together to create like a fun effect there in the center, like we did in the watercolor basics class. And then when everything is totally dry, at least on the outer edges, which my outer edges are dry, so I'm going to go ahead and peel off the tape. No rush on peeling off your tape, but when you do, then you get that nice clear edge, and it's just very satisfying. All right. So I'd love to see how y'all's turned out, or where you are in this process, if you're still going to be working on it after the class, if anybody wants to hold up their drawings, and we can spotlight you. So you'll just hit spotlight for everyone. So it makes on big screen. Okay, all right, Barbara. Yeah, that's lovely. I love the effect that you're getting there in the center. The way those colors have bled together is really lovely. Okay, this is Wrigley. Wrigley was the one giving me some of those flower part names last week. I appreciated the help. Yeah, that's nice. Oh, I love how you're just going for it with that dark purple. That's a really fun effect that's happening there. This is Graciela. Oh, that's beautiful. So delicate. Yes, I love the way you did the background with the browns, and that leaf is coming forward. Wow. I really love that effect. That's gorgeous. This is Autumn. Very nice, Autumn. Yeah, those colors are looking really nice together. And Shannon, ooh, those purples with the red violet, the way those are bleeding together and the petals, that's beautiful. Oh, and I can tell you're using such a delicate hand to get those corona filaments in there, and they're really starting to pop with that opaque gouache. Beautiful, Shannon. And this is Laurel. Oh, I love how you used more blues than purples. That's given it a different effect. That is really lovely. And your leaves have a really nice quality to them as well. They're different. And this is Diana. Oh, wow, Diana. Yeah, that is so three-dimensional. Those stamens are just like popping off. They're looking so realistic. I remember you holding up your mouth, your lip drawings a few weeks ago, and I was joking. This isn't your first time drawing lips. This isn't your first time painting a flower, I don't think either. That was gorgeous. Thank you all for sharing. It looks like we made it to the last 2 minutes of the class. Gwen saying thank you. Can't wait for another class from you. Thank you, Gwen. Yes, we'll be back in 2 weeks from tonight doing the drawing ears, and I'll have reference photos included for that one, and then we'll do the lemon and thyme study, and then the lemon and thyme painting on acrylic or on wood panel using acrylic. And if you post your work from tonight, don't forget to tag the work with those hashtags, make it with Michael's or Michael's classes, and tag me too, so I'll be sure to see it. And thank you all so much for a lovely class, and thank you, Rich, for being such a great moderator. Y'all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Adrienne. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.